It began not with swords, not even with shouts, but with silence. In the early morning haze, before the sun broke across the thatched roofs of a small village in southern England, a man named Auric stood at the edge of a barley field. His hands were rough from years of labor, his shoulders curved under the weight of seasons, of tax, of rules spoken from mouths far above his station. The dew clung to the edges of his boots as he stared out into the flat horizon, the same way his father had before him, and his grandfather before that. The land never changed, but the rules, the burdens, they only grew heavier. What no one saw that morning, not the steward in the manor house or the priest murmuring his morning prayers, was the shift. A small, almost invisible crack beneath the still surface of village life. A quiet pause in obedience. Auric's eyes didn't carry fire. They carried something colder, something that came after fire. A decision. It's easy now, hundreds of years later, to look at the peasant revolts of the Middle Ages as scattered outbursts. History books sometimes write them off as unorganized, poorly planned, even inevitable. But to truly understand why these uprisings were so intense, so sudden, and yes, so violent, you have to return to the world those peasants lived in. You have to smell the smoke from damp wood fires. Hear the church bell ring at odd hours. Feel the weight of coins you didn't own and laws you didn't choose. Peasants didn't wake up one day hungry for chaos. Revolt wasn't an ambition. It was a breaking point. The villagers in Auric's world lived by a rhythm that felt unshakable. You worked the land that belonged to the Lord. You gave a portion of your harvest to the manor. You paid taxes to the crown and tithe to the church. If the harvest was poor, you paid anyway. If a plague came, you still worked. You buried your children and returned to the field. It was not called suffering. It was simply life, the divine order, the will of God, spoken by men who wore soft robes and held parchment scrolls. But life has its limits. A man can endure hunger, cold, and humiliation for many seasons. He can stand while the thatch leaks over his children, while his wife wraps their last scraps of cloth around their feet. He can obey when soldiers pass through, demanding firewood and meat. He can even kneel when the local bailiff strikes him for stepping out of line. But somewhere, in some moment not even he can predict, he won't kneel anymore. That moment came often in the Middle Ages, and when it did, it was rarely peaceful. In the village of Branswick, where Auric lived, rumors moved faster than messengers. A merchant's son had come through weeks before, trailing behind a broken cart with splintered wheels and 2 thin oxen. He carried news that taxes were rising again. Something about a war far off, maybe in France. Or was it a new royal wedding? The villagers didn't know. They only knew that the next time the steward came for coin, he wouldn't ask. He'd take. And if there was no coin, he'd take chickens. Or blankets. Or time. Auric listened. Not just to the rumors, but to the murmurs that followed them. Quiet conversations held over buckets of water. Pauses between the lines of hymns. Glances traded when the priest spoke of obedience. These were the sounds of something growing. Not loud. Not yet. Even the manor lord, Sir Edwin, sensed it. He was a man born into silk sheets and iron armor. A man who hunted foxes for sport and drank wine from goblets etched with family crests. But even he, from the high wooden tower of his keep, saw the tension curling through his lands like mist. The peasants bowed, but not as deeply. They answered, but not with the same fear. He had ruled for years with a firm but tolerable hand. Yet lately, the murmurs felt like wrought under a wooden beam, silent, until the whole thing broke. It wasn't just Branswick. Across the countryside, across borders and kingdoms, the same rhythm was breaking. In Germany, groups of farmers banded together to ask, not demand, not threaten, just ask for fair treatment. In Flanders, weavers and dyers whispered of refusing royal duties. In France, peasants gathered in hidden groves and questioned whether nobles were truly chosen by God or just chosen by luck. The very ideas that propped up medieval society were being tugged at from below. Of course, not everyone wanted revolt. Some feared it. Others believed deeply in the order of things. But even among the faithful, something was shifting. The harvests were failing more often. Winters were colder. And the plague, black, cruel, and silent, had swept away entire villages just years earlier. Those who remained were changed. They had survived death. They had nothing left to lose. Alaric didn't plan to lead anything. He wasn't a leader. He couldn't read. He had never traveled more than 2 villages in any direction. But one morning, as the steward rode into town, flanked by 2 guards, demanding not only the usual tax, but an emergency levy for the crown, something snapped. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It wasn't even a blow. It was a refusal. Alaric didn't hand over his grain. He looked at the steward and said nothing. Just stood there. And something about that silence, calm, stubborn, rattled the man. The steward barked orders. One of the guards stepped forward, hand on his hilt. And that's when another villager, a quiet young man named Tom, stood beside Alaric. Then a woman. Then 2 older men. Within seconds, no one was alone. No weapons. No threats. Just a wall of peasants, their backs straight, eyes clear. The steward didn't swing his sword. Not that day. He left. And when he did, the whole village knew something irreversible had happened. They had tasted defiance. And it hadn't killed them. But the cost would come. It always did. From that day on, Brantswick wasn't just a village. It became a symbol, a spark in a field of dry hay. And across the kingdom, the wind was picking up. Word of what happened in Brantswick traveled in odd ways. Not through official letters or declarations, but on the lips of traders, passed like secrets over tankards of ale or whispered during rest breaks on dusty roads. The message was never spoken the same way twice, but the heart of it was clear. A village had stood its ground. No swords had clashed. No blood had spilled. And yet, the steward had retreated. Some dismissed the tale. Others leaned in and asked for details. But across fields and forests, across rivers and crumbling bridges, peasants listened. And in the quiet moments before sleep, they wondered, if Brantswick could say no, why couldn't we? But revolts don't spread overnight. They brew, sometimes for months, sometimes for generations. In Brantswick, life seemed to return to normal. Alaric went back to his fields. Tom continued shaping plows for neighbors. The women still baked bread in shared ovens and patched old tunics with worn threads. But everything was slightly different. The silence in the village was heavier. People spoke in shorter sentences, glancing over shoulders, weighing every word. They had crossed a line, even if no one had named it yet. And it wasn't long before Sir Edwin received the report. Not from the steward, who had grown strangely quiet, but from a visiting knight who had heard rumors from passing monks. Sir Edwin read the account in the candlelight of his solar, his fingers tightening around the parchment. He wasn't an evil man by the standards of his world, but he believed firmly in structure, in control, in knowing one's place. Rebellion, no matter how small, was not something he could allow to fester. He sent no letter, no warning. Instead, he summoned riders. They came at dawn, 3 days later. The hooves pounded the earth like thunder before the villagers saw the flags. 12 riders in polished armor, bearing the sigil of House Edwin. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask questions. They surrounded the village square, their horses snorting steam into the cold morning air. A young girl, no older than 10, dropped the bundle of kindling she was carrying and ran, crying to her mother. Alaric stepped forward, not with arrogance, but with calm. He knew this was always a possibility. But Sir Edwin didn't ride with his men. He had sent a man named Wulfric in his place, a seasoned commander with a face like stone and a voice that didn't rise or fall. Wulfric didn't draw his sword. He didn't need to. His eyes did the work. "You will pay what is owed," he said simply, "and you will kneel." Alaric didn't move. Neither did the others. Wulfric dismounted. The sound of his boots on the dirt road was sharper than it should have been. He stood directly in front of Alaric and spoke with quiet finality. "There are rules. You break them, you pay. That's the order of things." Alaric didn't answer. Wulfric raised a hand, not to strike, but to signal. One of the soldiers moved forward and grabbed Tom by the back of his tunic. There was a scuffle, but it ended quickly. Tom didn't fight back. He just looked at Alaric, and then at the others. The riders left just as suddenly as they came, dragging Tom behind them. No blood was spilled that day, either. But something had been taken, and the silence that followed wasn't brave, it was broken. That night, the villagers gathered in the barn behind the old mill. No one called the meeting. It just happened. Old men, tired mothers, teenage boys who had never raised a hand in anger. They all came. The air was thick with damp straw and unspoken questions. Alric stood near the center, not leading, just listening. And it was Tom's younger sister, Mira, who finally said what no one else dared. They'll come again. And next time, they won't take one of us. They'll take everything. The words echoed in the beams. The revolts of the medieval era didn't begin with battles. They began with absences, with fathers pulled from their homes, with bread missing from tables, with laws enforced by fear instead of fairness. The violence that came later was never the goal. It was the explosion after years of pressure, a final act of people who had been pushed too far for too long. In the weeks that followed Tom's capture, Brunswick watched the roads. Every rider, every cart, every passing monk was inspected from a distance. But there was no sign of him. The manor remained quiet, too quiet. And then one day, an old peddler arrived, bent-backed, missing teeth, cheerful despite his tattered cloak. He sold buttons and ribbon and simple knives carved from horn. But he also carried something else, a bit of parchment passed in secret from another village 2 towns over. It was a list, not a royal list, not a record of taxes or property, a list of names. People like Alric, like Tom, like Mira, names of those who had refused, spoken out, stood still when told to bow. The list was growing. So were the whispers. The peddler didn't stay the night. But before he left, he said one last thing. It's not just your village. It's all of us. Something's coming, bigger than any of us alone. That was when Alric knew. This wasn't a local problem anymore. It wasn't about one tax or one lord. It was a crack in the foundation of an entire way of life. And more people were seeing it every day. Still, they had no plan. No weapons beyond farming tools. No maps. Just a growing sense that their suffering wasn't isolated, that they were part of something larger, something that didn't have a name yet. But names were coming, and so were choices. The question wasn't if they would rise. The question was when, and how much it would cost. The first snow fell earlier than usual that year. It came like a warning, soft and quiet, blanketing the village in white before the last of the autumn barley had been stored away. The ground froze beneath their feet. Chickens pecked anxiously at the hard earth. Smoke drifted low from chimneys, curling like ghosts around the eaves of every home. Winter wasn't just a season in places like Brunswick. It was a test. It reminded the poor how close they lived to the edge of survival. With Tom gone and no word from the manor, the villagers did their best to hold on to normalcy. But even small things began to feel strange. The church bell rang later than it used to. The priest, once stern and commanding, now spoke with a gentler tone, as if unsure whether his words still held power. Children played more quietly. No one laughed the way they once did. It was as if the whole village was holding its breath. Mira often sat alone outside the small chapel, fingers pressed together in silent prayer. Not for answers. She didn't expect those anymore. But for time, for a sign that her brother might return. Alric saw her sometimes, and though he never spoke of it, her stillness made him ache in ways he didn't understand. Tom had been like a younger brother to him. Now his absence was a hole no one could fill. And then, one bitter morning, a trail of boot prints appeared on the snow-covered path leading to the center of the village. Fresh, deep, not made by any villager. They led to the door of the mill, and then vanished again, swallowed by drifting snow. No one had seen who made them. But later that day, a bundle was found leaning against the chapel door. Inside were 2 pieces of salted pork, a torn strip of red cloth, and a wooden token, burned on one side with a small symbol, a broken crown. No one knew what it meant, but it was left out in the open where all could see. Rumors swirled quickly. Some said it was a sign from a rebel group. Others thought it was a trap, bait to draw out anyone who might speak against the manor. Alric remained quiet, but that night, as the wind howled through cracks in the walls of his small cottage, he opened the door and stood in the cold, looking out toward the dark hills beyond the trees. Somewhere out there, people were organizing. whispering, planning. The fire that had sparked in Branswick was catching wind. Days turned into weeks. And then, at last, a message came, not by horse, not through parchment, but from a traveler on foot. He arrived at dusk, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, carrying nothing but a small sack and a walking stick. He looked like a pilgrim or a man escaping something behind him. But his eyes were alert, sharp with purpose. He called himself Joss. No last name, no title, just Joss. He didn't stay at the tavern. Instead, he asked to speak to Auric privately. They sat by the fire, steam rising from a chipped mug of elderflower tea. Joss didn't speak in grand speeches. He didn't raise his voice or flash signs of rebellion. He asked questions. What had happened with the steward? How had the village responded? Was there loyalty to the Lord still? Auric answered with honesty, and when he was finished, Joss simply nodded. You're not alone, he said. Then he reached into his cloak and placed a folded piece of parchment on the table. On it was a rough map, hand-drawn and worn, marking out villages, manors, and forests. Some names were crossed out. Others were circled in charcoal. Branswick was one of them. Joss told Auric there were others. Villages like theirs. Quiet for now. Watching. Waiting. But preparing. Not for war. Not yet. But for a movement. A refusal. A wave of silence that would become sound. He explained that no one man was leading this. That was the point. There would be no single rebel to hang or exile. It was a cause born in kitchens and fields, in stories shared by candlelight, in stolen glances between neighbors who had never dared to hope. They were building something scattered but strong, the kind of strength that couldn't be killed with a sword. Auric listened, not with eagerness, but with a slow understanding. We're not soldiers, he finally said. No, Joss agreed, but you're the backbone of the kingdom. And if the backbone refuses to bend, the whole thing breaks. He stayed only one night. By morning, he was gone, leaving no more than a few ashes in the hearth and the faint scent of crushed herbs. But something stayed behind, a shift in the air, the sense that a tide had turned. That week, Mira and two other villagers, an old weaver named Hilda and a soft-spoken shepherd named Elric, began gathering in the barn again. This time with purpose. They didn't speak of rebellion. They spoke of readiness, of making decisions together, of preparing food stores, of learning how to send messages without being heard, of watching the manor closely. The snow kept falling, but now it felt less like a blanket and more like a curtain before the storm. Then came Candlemas, a small festival, quiet, holy, marking the midpoint between winter and spring. In the old days, they would have lit candles in the chapel and prayed for light. This year, the villagers did light their candles, but not in prayer. They placed them in their windows, one in every home, at exactly the same hour. The manor steward noticed. He sent a rider to ask what it meant. No one answered. Later that evening, Auric stood outside his door, staring up at the soft flicker of candlelight in each window along the street. Not a word was spoken, not a command given, just silent unity. And though it was peaceful, though no sword had been drawn, Sir Edwin saw it for what it was, a declaration. Not of war, but of strength, and he would not tolerate it. The next message came not by mouth, but by fire. One night, near the edge of the village, a granary was set ablaze. The flames licked the sky as villagers ran to throw snow and water over the walls, trying to save what they could. The fire took half the stores and left a clear message. You're not safe. Auric didn't sleep that night. None of them did. The fire hadn't come from within. It had come from the outside, and it meant that the peace was over. The morning after the fire, smoke still drifted from the blackened remains of the granary. The scent of charred timber lingered in the air, mixing with the bitter cold, clinging to clothes and hair. Villagers moved slowly, their faces pale with fatigue and worry, eyes heavy from a night with no rest. Children clutched blankets, and the elderly sat near the ashes, saying nothing at all. They didn't have to. Everyone understood what had happened. Auric stood near the edge of the burned structure, his boots half buried in slush and ash. He didn't speak. His jaw was tight, and his eyes scanned the tree-line where the darkness still hid the truth. It wasn't an accident. No lantern had tipped over. No careless spark had drifted from a chimney. This was done on purpose. And it wasn't just about the food. It was about fear. A quiet message had been sent, and it was received. The villagers gathered that afternoon in the chapel, not because they expected comfort from the priest, but because they needed shelter from the weight of their own thoughts. The stone walls felt colder than usual, the stained glass casting pale colors over their anxious faces. Mira sat near the front, her hands at her lap, eyes on the floor. Hilda, the weaver, stood with her arms folded tight across her chest. Elric leaned against the back wall, silent and watching. Father Renaud looked older than he had a week ago. His voice trembled slightly as he began to speak, not a sermon, but a reminder of the world outside. He spoke of loyalty, of order, of patience. He didn't mention the fire. He didn't mention the name Sir Edwin. But the villagers weren't there to be reminded of rules. They had followed rules all their lives. That's what brought them to this point. Alric waited until the priest finished. Then he stepped forward. No one asked him to. He didn't raise his voice or speak like a leader. He just asked one question. What happens next? No one answered. Not at first. They glanced at each other, as if waiting for someone else to speak first. But the truth was, none of them knew. The revolt hadn't been planned. It wasn't a movement with banners or slogans. It had been a response, a natural, human reaction to too much being taken for too long. Elric finally spoke from the back. They want us to break. That fire wasn't for the food. It was for us. Hilda nodded. We survived worse than fire. We survived the plague. We buried our families. We worked through winters with nothing in our bowls. Someone else muttered. But how much more are we supposed to take? The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke had been. Meanwhile, in the manor house, Sir Edwin paced the stone floor of his hall, listening to Wulfric list the details of the fire. The knight's voice was calm, cold, efficient. He reported that no one had seen the attackers. No one had left the village that night, and the fire had started from the east. Wulfric didn't suggest it was done by the villagers themselves. That would have made no sense. He knew, as did Sir Edwin, that it came from outside, but the message was directed inward. Sir Edwin didn't like it, not because of the fire or even the risk of a food shortage. What unsettled him was the uncertainty. For the first time, he was not in control of the outcome. Someone, some group perhaps, was pushing the peasants into resistance. And if it worked in Branswick, it could spread. He ordered the guards doubled. He instructed his steward to send a fresh tax collection notice. Not immediately, but soon enough to remind the village who still ruled the land. And he wrote a letter, sealed with his family crest, to a higher lord, requesting permission to bring in men from outside the region if needed. Quietly, discreetly, back in the village, Alric and the others began making quiet preparations. They didn't call it resistance. They didn't speak of rebellion out loud. But small things started changing. They built hiding spots for tools. They began gathering extra cloth and storing dry food in secret. Elric taught the younger boys how to read the forest and move without sound. Mira started keeping a list, names of people who had come through the village, dates, what they carried, and what they said. It was simple, almost childlike, but it helped them feel less helpless. Even the priest seemed to shift. He didn't speak against them, not openly. He didn't report them. Perhaps he too was questioning the order of things. Perhaps he saw now that faith could live alongside resistance, that justice wasn't always quiet. But fear is patient. It doesn't vanish when fires die. One evening, Alric found a strange mark carved into the doorframe of the old smithy. A simple slash, crossed with another, barely noticeable unless you were looking. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't random. He showed it to Elric, who frowned and said nothing. But that night, he didn't return to his own hut. He kept watch near the edge of the village with a bow in his hand and a single arrow ready. The next day, a traveler passed through. Not Joss. This man was younger, dirtier, nervous. He didn't stay long, bought a loaf of bread and some cloth, then left in the direction of the river. But later, Mira found something tucked into the firewood pile behind the chapel. A scrap of cloth, folded tight, with a charcoal symbol drawn on the inside. The same broken crown. Beneath it, a few words. Keep moving. You are not alone. The Watchers are near. It wasn't signed. They didn't know who the Watchers were. Allies? Spies? Another village? No one knew. But the symbol appeared again 2 nights later, this time carved into the bark of a tree at the far edge of the barley field. Something, or someone, was circling them. Alric didn't speak of it to everyone. Only Mira, Elric, and Hilda. They agreed not to raise alarm yet. But they began meeting more often, sometimes late at night in the chapel basement, sometimes in the woods beyond the mill, speaking in whispers and lighting no fires. They made plans, not for war, but for survival. Still, none of them knew how close danger really was. Because on the edge of the county, in a crumbling watchtower long abandoned by royal guards, a man named Tane was drawing lines on a piece of old sheepskin. He wasn't a knight. He wasn't a noble. He had once been a soldier, dismissed for reasons no one remembered clearly. Now he was something else entirely, hired by a lord whose name he never used, paid in coin that bore the seal of a region far from Brantswick. Tane had been following rumors for months. Villages standing firm, quiet resistance, and now he had names, a map, and a list. At the top of that list was the name Alric, and Tane was getting closer. The wind carried a sharpness that night, slipping through the wooden shutters of every cottage and curling beneath door frames like an unwelcome guest. Alric sat by the fire, staring into the low orange flame, its glow flickering softly across the walls. His hands were wrapped around a cup of broth, long since gone cold. He wasn't tired, not in the usual sense. He just couldn't stop listening to every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside, every faint rustle that might have been nothing or might have been something. He didn't tell anyone, but he'd been dreaming of fire again. Not the kind that warmed, but the kind that devoured. Down the path, Mira was awake too. She lay on her cot beside the hearth, her fingers tracing the edge of the parchment she now kept tucked under the cornerstone. It was the map Joss had given them, still smudged with ash and old fingerprints. Each time she looked at it, she saw something new, a forgotten village, a faint trail, a mark she hadn't noticed before. It comforted her in strange ways. Proof that they weren't the only ones. That somewhere, beyond the reach of the manor and its soldiers, people were also watching and waiting. The next morning came without incident. Just gray skies, the quiet bustle of morning chores, and the dull ache of repetition. But something was different. A group of men, strangers, were seen on the ridge just past the orchard. No horses, just cloaks, walking sticks, and distant silhouettes. They didn't come down into the village. They didn't speak to anyone. By the time Elric climbed the path to get a closer look, they were gone. No one spoke of it out loud, but it left a knot in every stomach. 3 days later, a second granary burned, this time in the neighboring village of Braceford, just beyond the river. Braceford had no history of resistance. It had always been quiet, compliant, loyal to the manor. But now it lay blackened and stunned, its food stores destroyed in a single night. No warnings, no witnesses. When the news reached Brantswick, Alric felt the breath leave his lungs. Not because of the fire, but because this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about pressure. Someone wanted the region unstable, hungry, nervous. And the fires, they were only the beginning. Later that night, Alric met with Mira, Hilda, and Elric in the woods behind the old well. Snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they circled around a fallen log. Mira brought the map. Elric brought a hunting blade. Hilda brought bread and a flask of something warm. They didn't know who to trust anymore. Even among villagers, doubts had begun to settle like frost on windows. Whispers that someone among them was reporting to the manor, that the second fire had been seen before it started, that a hooded man had passed through the village a week earlier, asking questions about a blacksmith who had once spoken out of turn. "I don't believe it," Mira said, shaking her head. "No one here would do that." But Hilda wasn't so sure. Fear changes people, makes them do strange things, especially when their children are hungry. They sat in silence for a while after that. When they finally stood to leave, Elric handed Alric a rolled scrap of cloth. Inside was a message written in hurried, slanted charcoal. "The Watchers are not what they seem. Trust only those you've bled beside. More will come before spring. Choose your moment wisely." There was no name, no symbol, just a message and a faint scent of smoke. Back at the manor, Sir Edwin had received a visitor of his own, a courier from the capital. Not a soldier, but someone even more dangerous. A man with no banner, no insignia, dressed in a plain traveling coat and carrying a sealed leather pouch. He didn't introduce himself. He simply handed over the letter, bowed, and left without taking food or drink. The letter was from a higher noble, someone Sir Edwin rarely heard from directly. It didn't contain instructions. It contained an expectation. The uprisings, however small, were becoming troublesome. If Edwin couldn't restore order quickly, the crown would send others to do it, and those others wouldn't ask nicely. Sir Edwin didn't sleep that night. At the same time, deep in the forest miles from Branswick, Tane sharpened a blade slowly beside a low campfire. He had found another mark, etched into a stone near the river bend. The broken crown again. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. His work had taken him to many villages, and he had learned long ago that rebellion rarely came from one act. It came in layers. Hunger, grief, silence, and then, inevitably, hope. Hope, he believed, was the most dangerous part. He didn't fear swords. He feared people who had nothing left to lose. By the time snow began to melt along the lower paths, something else changed in Branswick. A boy, no older than 16, arrived alone. He said he'd come from the west, that his village had been emptied, not burned, not raided, just abandoned. Families vanished. Homes left as if someone had rung a bell, and everyone had stood up and walked into the woods. Alric questioned him gently. Mira watched the boy's face closely. There was no sign of lying, no twitch of uncertainty. Just a dull emptiness in his voice, the sound of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. "We didn't hear anything," the boy said. "No screams, no orders. Just woke up and they were gone." Mira offered him bread. He took it slowly, as if afraid it might vanish too. That night, Mira wrote his village name down on the back of the map. It was the fourth to vanish since the frost had come. The pattern was no longer about punishment. This was something else, something larger, coordinated, the kind of thing that didn't rely on brute force, but silence, shadows, disappearance. Hilda began collecting herbs, not just for healing, but for keeping people awake. Elric built a new bow. Mira taught 3 other children how to spot traps in the forest. Alric spoke less, but thought more. He had once believed their small act of defiance was local. Now he understood it was part of something spreading across the land like unseen roots. Everywhere peasants were saying no, but they weren't just resisting taxes. They were resisting being erased. And far away, just beyond the hills that framed the kingdom's spine, spring waited to return. But when it did, nothing would be the same. The snow finally began to melt in the second week of March. Long ribbons of water carved paths through the dirt roads, and the frost on the windows gave way to soft morning light. But spring didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a warning. The silence in Branswick was no longer the quiet of waiting. It was the kind of silence before something breaks. The boy from the west, whose name was Rain, stayed in a cottage near the blacksmith's. He barely spoke, but he watched everything. Watched the way villagers looked over their shoulders, the way they stopped conversations mid-sentence when footsteps approached. He asked Alric once, while repairing a loose shutter, why they didn't just leave. Alric had stared at the horizon for a long time before answering. "Because this is our ground. You don't run from roots." Rain didn't ask again. Across the village, people prepared in small ways. No one said what they were preparing for. That would have made it real. But the signs were everywhere. Extra nails driven into door frames. Stones stacked near entryways. Tools hidden beneath floorboards. Even the children were quieter now. They could feel it too. Elric scouted the woods daily, returning each time with new reports. The hoofprints weren't from local riders. The sigils carved into bark were different now. More complex, sometimes drawn over older marks. And once, he found an arrow. Not from any villager, not made by any nearby craftsman. Sleek, sharp, dark-feathered. A hunter's arrow, but not one used for food. The priest, Father Renaud, stopped preaching altogether. He still rang the chapel bell, still tended the candles. But his voice was hoarse, his prayers quiet and mumbled, as if even he was afraid to be heard. One afternoon, Mira and Alric walked to the edge of the barley field. The last of the snow was sinking into the soil, leaving it damp and ready for planting. But neither of them carried seeds. They just stood there, looking out across the land. "I keep thinking," Mira said softly, "what if we're wrong?" Alric didn't respond. What if no one's coming? What if all of this, the hiding, the silence, the fear, what if it leads to nothing? He looked at her then, not with certainty, but with something steadier. A kind of quiet resolve that didn't need answers. Then we still stood. We didn't let them take what we are. That night, the first letter arrived. It wasn't delivered. It was discovered, wedged between the chapel doors at dawn. Sealed in wax, stamped with no crest. Just a single word on the outside, attention. Inside was a message, written in an unfamiliar hand. Short, cold, deliberate. You've been warned once. The second won't come. The crown watches. Your silence will not protect you. There was no name. No threat had ever sounded so calm. Mira read the letter aloud to the others in the chapel basement. No one interrupted. When she finished, Hilda took the paper and burned it over the lantern flame, watching the ashes fall into a cracked bowl. Elric stood. They're already watching us. That letter wasn't a threat. It was a test. They're waiting to see who breaks first. Alric nodded. And we won't. But even as he said it, a small part of him wondered how long they could keep saying that before it stopped being true. Later that week, a second traveler arrived. Older, grayer, leaning on a walking stick. He claimed to be a herbalist, passing through on his way to a trading village near the coast. But when Alric offered him food and rest, the man leaned close and whispered, "I know what you're doing here." Alric froze. "You're not alone," the man added, voice low and steady. "You've already sparked something. Even if you fall, others will rise after you." He didn't explain further. He stayed only one night, and by morning, he was gone. No footprints left behind, no sign of travel, as if the woods had swallowed him whole. But he had left something in the barn, tucked behind a broken beam. Another map. This one was larger, finer. Dozens of villages marked, circled, or crossed out. But there was a line drawn through the center, a faded red thread pulled across the parchment and pinned down with melted wax. Along that line were symbols, arrows, excess, and once again the broken crown. Mira stared at it for hours. It wasn't just a message. It was a route. An underground movement was already moving beneath the surface of their land, connecting villages like nerves under skin. Someone, or many, were pulling strings from the shadows, building something that couldn't be seen from towers or thrones. But for all its markings, the map offered no protection. It didn't tell them what would come, only that something would. And it came at dusk. A scream. One loud, human sound, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Elric reached the site first. The far side of the orchard. A man from the village, Jared, the miller's cousin, was lying on the frozen grass, his shirt torn, eyes wide open. He wasn't dead, but he couldn't speak. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and his left hand was burned. Not by accident. The mark was intentional. Someone had pressed a seal against his palm. Mira washed his wounds. Alric sat beside him through the night, but the man never spoke. Not a word, not even a whisper, just stared into the dark ceiling like he had seen something he couldn't ever forget. By morning, half the village had heard, and by noon, no one denied it anymore. There was no safety left in pretending. This was no longer about food or taxes or defiance. This was about control, and someone was making sure they remembered who had it. Alric stood in the center of the village that evening, surrounded by flickering torches and shivering faces. "We are not soldiers," he said, "but we are not blind. They want us to be afraid. They want us to turn on each other, to doubt, to kneel." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But we know the truth now, and it's not just ours anymore. Mira stepped forward, holding the new map, her hand steady. They think we're alone, but we're not. And somewhere deep in the woods, hidden beneath roots and branches and silence, Tane listened. He smiled, not because they were wrong, but because they were right, and that made them even more dangerous. The days grew longer, but no one in Branswick noticed the sunlight. Time felt strange, like it had stopped moving in the way it used to. People still tended to their animals, fetched water, and baked bread, but their minds were somewhere else, always listening, always watching, always waiting. The memory of Jared's burned hand haunted everyone. He still hadn't spoken. Mira sat with him each morning, reading old prayers aloud, even though she didn't believe in them the way she once did. She just hoped the sound of her voice would reach something inside him. Elric had changed. He spoke less, moved differently. He no longer asked permission to patrol the woods. He just went. He tracked footprints, noted shifts in the wind, and memorized the strange signs left near the ridge. Sometimes it was a bundle of herbs tied with red thread. Sometimes a feather nailed into the bark of a tree. One day he returned with a piece of cloth, fine, far too fine to belong to a villager. It had a golden edge, and it was soaked in something dark. He didn't say blood. He didn't have to. There were other changes, too. The manor hadn't sent another rider in weeks. No collectors, no messages, not even patrols. It wasn't kindness. It was control. The absence was louder than a threat. The villagers knew someone was watching them, learning their habits, waiting for them to make a mistake. They began to distrust their own shadows. Alric tried to keep the center from cracking. He visited each home, checked on the elderly, helped repair doors and grind grain. Not because he had answers, but because movement helped him feel less helpless. He saw how tired the people were, not from work, but from worry. Everyone carried questions in their eyes they were too afraid to ask. One morning, a small child wandered too far from the fields. Just 5 years old. Her name was Anwen. When her mother noticed, a dozen people spread out to search. They found her 2 hours later, barefoot and cold, standing near the edge of the woods. She wasn't crying. She just pointed to the trees and said, "He told me to go home." When asked who, she just said, "The man with no shoes." No one saw him. No one found tracks. But near where she'd stood, Mira discovered a tiny pile of stones, arranged in a perfect circle. Beneath them was a torn piece of hide, marked with a broken crown. Later that day, Hilda confronted Auric. She wanted to know if they were making progress, if anyone from outside had reached them. But he had nothing new to share. He hadn't heard from Joss or the Traveler since the second map. Hilda's voice cracked when she spoke. "We need more than symbols. We need help. We can't fight smoke with silence." Auric agreed. That night, he decided to send someone beyond the valley. A scout. Not Elric. He was too valuable here. And not Mira. They couldn't risk losing her. Instead, Rain volunteered. The boy who had nothing left. His own village was gone, and he had nothing tying him to Branswick but kindness. Auric tried to refuse, but Rain insisted. He wanted purpose. He wanted to know that whatever had swallowed his home wouldn't do the same here. They gave him food, a knife, a warm cloak, and one of the maps. He would head toward the east, toward the villages marked with red arrows. Maybe there would be answers. Maybe there would be others like them. The morning he left, most of the village came out to see him off. No one said goodbye. It was too hard. Mira handed him a small packet of herbs for strength. Elric clasped his shoulder once. Auric nodded, quietly proud of the courage the boy didn't know he had. Rain walked into the woods, and for a long time, his footsteps echoed in the silence behind him. But even as he left, something new was arriving. In the manor house, Sir Edwin met with a man he had not summoned. He wore no crest, no colors. He gave no name. He spoke softly, but his words were firm. He was not part of the crown, he said, but he served its needs. The kingdom was losing patience with scattered resistance. Villages like Branswick were becoming examples, not of war, of rot. If order was not restored, others would lose faith. The peasants would begin to believe the system was just a story. Sir Edwin, humiliated and anxious, agreed to everything the stranger suggested. Reinforcements, shadowed agents, punishments without paperwork. The man handed him a ring, plain, silver, and cold to the touch. "You'll know them by this," he said, "and they'll know who you are." The next night, 3 strangers arrived at Braceford under cover of dark. No torches, no flags, just quiet boots and long knives. The village was asleep when the first door opened. By morning, half the homes stood empty. A message arrived in Branswick the next day, delivered by a farmer from across the river. Folded parchment, sealed with wax, and a small ring pressed into the corner. Braceford fell without a sound. Your turn is coming. No name, no demand, just certainty. Myra's hands trembled as she read it. Elric gritted his teeth. Hilda crossed herself for the first time in years. But it was Elric who felt the weight settle deep in his chest, because he knew the time for silence was ending. And somewhere far to the east, Rain crouched behind a stone wall, eyes wide as he watched smoke rise from another nameless village. He clutched the map in his hand, heart pounding, footsteps approaching in the dark. The smell of smoke reached Rain before he saw the flames. Thick and heavy, it clung to the air and filled his lungs as he crouched in the underbrush, heart pounding in his chest. The village ahead was small, just a scattering of thatched roofs and crooked fences, but it had the same shape as Branswick, the same quiet hope. Or maybe it had, because now it was burning. He watched from the shadows as figures moved between homes. Not villagers. These men wore dark tunics, and their movements were precise, fast. They weren't looting. They weren't searching. They were simply clearing the place out. Rain's fingers tightened around the small knife Elric had given him. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just watched. He stayed hidden until the fire had reduced most of the homes to glowing ruins. Then, slowly, he backed away. Every branch, every dried leaf beneath his boots seemed too loud. But the men didn't look back. They had done what they came for. By nightfall, Rain had found shelter under a fallen tree, using moss to cover the glowing cloth of his coat. He didn't sleep. He stared at the stars above and thought of Branswick. He thought of Myra's quiet voice, of Elric's steady eyes, of the way Elric could spot a trail no one else saw. They didn't know yet. They couldn't know that the fires weren't random anymore. They were spreading like a pattern. Every village marked with resistance was being removed like rot from wood. He had to get back. In Branswick, tension lived in every shadow. The villagers didn't speak of the message from Braceford, but everyone had seen the wax seal, had noticed the way Elric's hands shook slightly as he passed it to Mira. They all felt the same thing. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was the certainty that time was running out. Hilda gathered the women in her home that evening. They didn't speak of rebellion or war. They spoke of what would happen to the children if soldiers came, where they would hide, who would carry the youngest. Mira suggested the old storage cave near the East Ridge, forgotten by most, but still dry. It wouldn't save them all, but it might give some of them a chance. Elric began sleeping in shifts, always near the outer fields. He buried iron spikes beneath fallen leaves and sharpened traps used for wolves. He hadn't said it out loud, but Mira knew. He didn't expect to survive what was coming. He just wanted to slow it down. Elric, for his part, visited each household with steady calm, checking walls, offering quiet advice, making sure people didn't feel alone. But he didn't sleep much anymore. At night, he sat near the chapel, watching the stars, wondering if Rain had made it, wondering if this would be their last quiet week. Then came the rider. It was just passed on when they heard hooves. One horse, no guards, no banners. He rode into the village like he owned it, cloaked in thick wool, his face mostly hidden. He stopped near the well, dismounted, and waited. Not impatiently, just calmly, like he knew they would come. They gathered slowly. Elric stepped forward, Mira just behind him. The rider said nothing at first. Then he pulled something from his satchel and held it out. It was a small leather pouch, tied with twine. Mira took it and opened it carefully. Inside were pieces of scorched cloth, a broken wooden spoon, and a thin strip of parchment. You were warned. The fire moves next. No name, no symbol, but the message was clear. The rider turned to leave, but Elric stepped forward. Wait, he said. Who sent you? The man didn't answer, but he paused just long enough to let the silence linger before riding away, hooves kicking dust across the still sleeping street. The village didn't return to work that day. People stood in clusters, whispering, watching the road, checking the sky for smoke that hadn't come yet. Children stayed indoors. The animals grew restless. Even the wind seemed to avoid Branswick, passing over without touching it. Mira gathered with Elric, and Hilda in the barn. "They're testing us," she said. "They want to see if we'll run before they strike." Hilda looked toward the door. "Maybe we should." But Elric shook his head. "And go where? Every place like ours is either ash or waiting to be. If we scatter, we'll lose what little strength we have." Mira leaned forward. "Then we don't run. We don't wait. We send word to the others." Elric hesitated. "We don't know who's still standing. We have to try." That night, 3 messengers were chosen. Quiet, trusted villagers, 2 women and a shepherd boy, each carrying a part of the map copied by Mira. They would travel different paths, heading toward different corners of the region, in hopes of reaching any other village that still remembered how to hope. They left before dawn, without goodbyes, slipping into the fog with only cloaks and courage. Meanwhile, Rain was still days away, his feet blistered, his mouth dry, but his mind locked on the image of the burning village. He had marked the way back, remembered every bend in the trail, every twisted tree and broken stone. He couldn't fail, not now. Branswick had to know what was coming. Not just threats, not just silence, but a force determined to erase them. In a clearing just past the old quarry, he paused to drink from a stream. That's when he saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked, watching him from across the water. Rain froze. The figure raised one hand, palm open, then slowly pointed to the south and vanished. No sound, no broken branches, just gone. Rain's legs trembled. He didn't know if it was a warning or a sign of help, but he turned south and kept running. Back in Branswick, night settled again. The air was too still, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Elric walked through the fields, watching the tree line, listening for movement. The torches had been hidden, the traps set, the children taught where to hide, but there was no telling when it would come. Inside the chapel, Mira lit one candle, not for prayer, for the message it would send. They were still here, still standing, and if the fire was coming, they would face it together. The candle in the chapel burned low, its wax dripping slowly onto the stone floor like silent seconds counting down. Mira watched the flame flicker, her hand resting lightly on the table beside her, but her mind was far from peaceful. She kept thinking of the map. How many places had already turned to ash? How many names had been scratched out? Braceford, the nameless village near the river. Maybe more by now. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the smoke Rain had described. Outside, the village had grown too quiet. Even the animals seemed uneasy, pacing within fences, their sounds thin and scattered. Elric spent most of his time just beyond the orchard, kneeling behind tall grass, scanning the hills. He'd seen movement 2 nights ago, shadows near the tree line, too far to be sure, but too still to be wildlife. He hadn't told anyone except Elric. There was no sense in adding panic to fear. Elric didn't sleep anymore. He walked the village at night, torch in hand, not to protect it with fire, but to remind it that someone was still watching. The weight of what was coming pressed down harder with each step. His thoughts kept circling the same questions. Would they attack at night? Would they burn everything or take prisoners? Would they leave anyone behind? No one knew. The 3 messengers had not returned. No word, no signal, just silence. Maybe they had made it. Maybe they hadn't. Mira kept a small rock on the chapel table, one for each of them. A quiet ritual, nothing more, but it helped her focus. Then came the whistle. A sharp, high sound, brief but unmistakable. Not a bird, not the wind. A signal. Elric was the first to respond, darting from his post, sprinting across the field toward the sound. He reached the edge of the forest, bow ready, eyes wide. And then he saw the boy, Rain, covered in mud, breathless, face scratched and bleeding from bramble thorns, but alive. He collapsed into Elric's arms, gasping. They're coming. They're close. They burned another village. No warning. No talking. Just fire. They're 2 days behind me. Maybe less. Elric didn't hesitate. He carried Rain back like a sack of grain, shouting for Mira, for Elric, for anyone who could hear. Within minutes, the village gathered near the chapel. Faces pale, hands clutching cloaks and each other. Rain sat on the steps, a blanket wrapped around him, Mira pressing a wet cloth to his head. "There's more of them now," he whispered, voice shaking. Not just riders. Archers. Quiet ones. They wait until people sleep. Then they light everything. The ones who run. He didn't finish. Alric turned to the others, his voice low and firm. We don't run. We don't wait. We make them come through us. That night, the village transformed. The final grain sacks were buried in hidden pits. The children were moved to the eastern cave, with 2 older villagers to watch over them. Tools were sharpened into weapons. Spears made from broomsticks and rusted knives. Axes cleaned. Shovels gripped like swords. No one had armor, but they had resolve. Mira tore her old cloak into strips and wrapped them around forearms, tied them around heads. If we fall, she said quietly to Hilda, we'll at least fall knowing we didn't kneel. The torch was lit again on the chapel roof, the signal they had agreed on if danger was imminent. They didn't know who might see it. Maybe no one. Maybe the watchers. Maybe it would just be a message to the sky. The first sounds came the next evening. Horse hooves, slow, deliberate, circling the village like a predator testing prey. Then silence again. No voice, no face, just the sound, then nothing. That night, no one slept. They stood in pairs or alone, eyes fixed on the tree line, hearts racing with every gust of wind. Mira stood beside Alric in the field near the well, the place where the first warning had come weeks ago, the place where Jared had been found. The air was too still. Then, just before dawn, a bird call. Wrong. Off-key. A signal. Elric spun to the west side. They're here. Shadows moved behind the trees, too quick to count, too quiet for soldiers. The first torch appeared moments later, far off, but then another. And another. Forming a line. They were surrounding Branswick. Alric raised his voice, not to shout orders, but to say one thing, hold the line. The villagers took their places. Behind fences, on rooftops, near the chapel, holding weapons they had never used in battle. Faces full of fear, but feet planted deep in the earth. Then the drums began. Not loud, not fast, just a slow beat, echoing from the forest, unnatural and chilling. Mira turned to Alric, whispering, they want us to break before they even reach us. But they didn't move. The fire didn't come yet. The men in the trees stayed just out of reach, letting the sound of fear do the work. Hours passed. The sun began to rise behind gray clouds, casting pale light across the village. Still no attack. Then came a figure. He stepped out of the forest alone. No weapon, no armor. Just dark clothes and a pale silver ring on one hand. He walked slowly toward the chapel, stopping halfway through the field. Alric met him there, Mira following close. The man didn't introduce himself. You've been stubborn, he said, voice even. You've been warned. Alric didn't reply. You've had your chance to walk away. But you built your fences. You sharpened tools. You lit your torches. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. So now you burn with them. He turned without waiting for an answer. But Mira stepped forward. Why us? Why now? The man paused. Because silence is easier when examples are made. Then he disappeared into the trees. And the drums stopped. Only the wind remained. Mira looked at Alric. It's coming. He nodded. No one ran. They stood their ground. And somewhere deep in the woods, fires sparked to life again. Only this time, Branswick was ready. The sky turned a pale silver as the early sun pressed against thick clouds, but it brought no warmth. It was the kind of morning that should have felt like peace after a long night, but to the people of Branswick, it felt like the last breath before storm. Everyone was awake. No one had left. Every man, woman, and child old enough to walk knew what today was. The forest had fallen silent again. That, more than the drums, more than the torchlights, was what twisted the fear deeper. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind, no rustling branches. Just that heavy, waiting kind of silence that comes when something watches and waits, deciding when to strike. Alric stood near the chapel, gripping a spear carved from an old fence post, the end hardened in fire. Around him, other villagers took their positions, many with hands trembling, but no one backing away. Elric had climbed the water tower with a bough made from you. Mira stayed close to the middle of the village where she could help move the wounded, if it came to that. And deep behind the ridge, hidden from view, the children slept in the old cave, guarded by Hilda and two others. Rain leaned beside the well, holding a torch not yet lit. His body was still sore from travel, but his eyes were sharper now. Harder. This was no longer about revenge for his lost village. This was about stopping it from happening again. Then a branch cracked. It was small, barely a sound, but enough. Alric raised his hand. From the tree line, dark shapes emerged slowly. They walked in formation, not running, not charging, just stepping forward like they already knew how this would end. There were 12 of them, cloaked, silent, their faces shadowed. Behind them, more figures appeared. Too many to count. Some carried bows, some long blades. All of them carried that same air of cold purpose. And then, flame. One man raised a torch and tossed it into the outer fence. It landed with a dull thud and sputtered. The wood was wet with dew. The fire didn't catch. Another torch flew, this time landing near a pile of hay. The flame hissed to life. Still, the villagers didn't move. From the tower, Elric loosed the first arrow. It struck one of the torch-bearers in the leg, sending him sprawling into the mud. That was the only signal needed. In seconds, everything changed. The invaders surged forward. They came from all sides, leaping over fences, swinging blades, lighting fires. The villagers answered, not like soldiers, but like people who had drawn a line and finally said, no more. Alric led a group near the well, clashing with two masked men. The sounds of metal against would fill the air. Mira ran to pull a wounded boy from behind a chicken coop, dragging him into the chapel where they had gathered makeshift bandages. Rain lit his torch and used it to push back two attackers near the grain storage, his hands blistering, eyes full of fury. Flames caught along the west side, crawling up the walls of a tool shed. Smoke began to rise, but so did the resistance. Elric's arrows flew with frightening rhythm, dropping invaders as they moved toward the chapel. One woman, Gretna, the baker, knocked a man down with a rolling pin before two others dragged him into a trap lined with sharpened sticks. The man screamed once, then stopped. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. And then a horn blew, a deep, hollow sound that came not from the forest, but from the southern hills. Everyone froze for a breath. Out of the trees, a second group of cloaked men charged, not toward Branswick, but toward the invaders. The attackers turned, confused. One of them shouted something, a command, or maybe a warning. The two forces collided in the field outside the village. Swords clashed. Arrows flew. A different symbol flashed in the sunlight, painted on the cloaks of the new arrivals. Not the broken crown. Something else. A circle of flame. Alric stared in disbelief. Mira stood at the chapel steps, torn between awe and fear. "Who are they?" she whispered. But no one answered. The battle shifted, grew louder, Messier. Smoke thickened in the sky as fire took hold of the western storehouse. Mira shouted for help and ran to stop it spreading. Villagers poured buckets of water, coughing and choking, but working together. Every hand mattered. Every second counted. Near the well, Alric faced a masked man who lunged with a blade. They struggled, feet slipping in the mud, the spear cracking in half between them. Alric fell back, scrambling for balance, as the attacker raised his sword, but then an arrow struck him through the throat. Elric, still watching from above. By now, the invading force was faltering. Between the villagers' fierce stand and the mysterious new arrivals cutting through their flank, they began to retreat. A few dropped weapons and ran into the trees. Others dragged their wounded back toward the ridge. The leader, the man with the silver ring, stood near the chapel, his face still calm despite the chaos. He locked eyes with Alric for just a moment, then disappeared into the smoke. Just like that, they were gone. But the fighting hadn't ended. Fire still burned. The injured still bled. Mira worked through the chapel floor, bandaging arms and legs, whispering to those too weak to speak. Hilda appeared from the eastern trail, shouting that the children were safe. Rain stumbled into the church, face covered in soot, holding a torn piece of cloth with a flaming circle symbol. He handed it to Alric. "They're not from the manor," he said breathlessly. They're from somewhere else. They've been watching too, waiting for the right moment. Alric took the cloth slowly, feeling the weight of it. Do they mean to help? Rain didn't answer. Outside, the smoke lifted just enough to reveal the horizon, and figures moving along it. Silent, watching, not advancing, not retreating, a line drawn in the distance, waiting for something, and deep beneath the ground of Branswick, the earth still burned. The moment of truth hadn't come yet, but it was closer than ever. The air hung thick with ash and smoke, curling around rooftops and drifting through the trees like ghosts left behind. The fires had been beaten back, but not entirely extinguished. A few homes still hissed and popped as damp cloth smothered hot embers. The villagers moved slowly now, bloodied, bruised, and bone-tired, but still standing, still breathing. Mira leaned against the chapel doorframe, her hands covered in soot, her hair clinging to her face in damp streaks. Her arms ached from lifting the wounded, her throat raw from shouting over the fire and chaos. But her eyes, red as they were, burned with something deeper, rage, and something close to resolve. Alric stood nearby, turning the torn symbol Rain had given him over in his fingers. The flame-shaped circle, drawn in red ink, now smudged and faded. The strangers who bore that mark had vanished back into the woods just as quickly as they had arrived. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't stayed. They came like a wind, disrupted the attack, and disappeared before questions could form. Elric had descended from the tower, face pale, his arrows nearly spent. He leaned heavily against his bow as he approached Alric. "They're watching," he said quietly, nodding toward the far ridge. Alric followed his gaze. In the distance, barely visible through the thinning smoke, were figures. 5, maybe more, still unmoving. They didn't step forward. They didn't retreat. They just watched. Mira joined them. "Do you think they're part of the same force that helped us?" Alric shook his head. They didn't fight. They came after. "Then who are they?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "But they didn't come to finish what the others started. At least not yet." Inside the chapel, Jared stirred for the first time in days. His eyes fluttered open, glazed and confused. Mira rushed to him, kneeling beside the cot. "Jared," she whispered, gently touching his forehead. He blinked. "The man with the silver ring. He spoke to me." Alric turned toward them. "What did he say?" Jared struggled to find the words. "He said there was a list, that we were on it. Villages marked for removal. To make way for something else." "What else?" Mira asked, heart racing. Jared coughed, his voice barely above a breath. "A new order. A different rule. He said the old ways are too soft. That fear works better than faith." Alric exchanged a look with Mira. "They're not just trying to scare us. They're testing a system." That evening, as dusk fell again over Branswick, Mira gathered everyone near the chapel steps. There were bruised faces, bandaged arms, and tear-stained cheeks in the crowd, but there was also fire in their eyes. They had survived the first wave. That alone was something most villages hadn't managed. Alric stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't give a speech. He just spoke the truth. "They'll come again, and next time, they'll bring more." A murmur ran through the crowd. "We've seen what they do. We know what they want, to erase us and build something cruel in our place. But they made one mistake." He paused. "They let us live." The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. That night, Mira, Alric, Elric, and Rain met in the chapel with what remained of the maps. They pieced them together on the altar, tracing paths, marking confirmed villages that had vanished, noting where the mysterious fire circle allies had appeared. Rain pointed to one location. "I think this is where they came from. I passed it before the last village fell. It was quiet, too quiet, like a ghost town, but someone had been there recently. I saw signs, snuff fires, fresh ash, broken branches." Elric nodded. "Could be a hideout, or a meeting place." Mira tapped her finger on the map. "If we can reach them, maybe we can understand who's fighting back. Maybe we're not as alone as we think." Alric looked up. "Then we go. We don't wait for another fire. We find a flame before it burns again." The decision was made. At first light, a small team would head south, led by Rain. Elric would go with him. Mira would stay behind with Hilda, to help the wounded and prepare the rest for another possible attack. But as they planned, a soft knock echoed from the chapel door. Alaric moved cautiously and opened it. A man stood there, older, cloaked with a limp. He didn't speak, just reached into his coat and handed Alaric a small book, leather-bound and worn from travel. Inside were names, dozens of them, villages, people, coordinates, symbols. Some were crossed out, some were circled. The first page read, "The kingdom of flame is rising. If you want to live, choose your side before the fire reaches your door." The man vanished into the night as quietly as he'd come. Elric stared at the book. Who are these people? Mira answered without looking up. They're the ones reshaping the kingdom. Alaric nodded slowly, eyes locked on the open door. And we just stepped into their game. Beyond the hills, hidden behind thick forests and scattered ruins, a new power was moving. One that didn't wait for permission. One that saw peasants not as people, but as pieces to be moved or removed. The worst hadn't come yet, but Brantswick was no longer a name on a list. It was a spark, and sparks, when left alone, find others. Then they burn. Alaric sat in silence long after the door closed, the worn book still open in his hands. The candlelight flickered across the inked names, the ones circled and the ones crossed out, and though the fire was low, his face looked as if he'd just seen a ghost. Mira stood behind him, her hands trembling slightly. She had read the first few pages. That was enough. Elric paced by the chapel wall. "This is worse than we thought," he muttered. "It's not just about control or taxes or punishment. It's about remaking everything. Every village that refuses, gone. Every name that resists, removed. And not by the crown," Mira whispered. "Not only the crown." That was the twist they hadn't seen coming. The book revealed more than names and burned-out villages. It hinted at something larger, letters encoded in margins, symbols scrawled beside certain places. There were mentions of a council, one that met in secret far from royal oversight. A movement, yes, but not one united. The kingdom of flame, as it called itself, was fractured from within. Some wanted to replace the king with a new throne. Others wanted to erase thrones altogether. But all of them agreed on one thing. Fear was faster than faith. And silence was the only acceptable answer from the common folk. Mira turned to Alaric. "If we go south looking for allies, we could be walking into another trap." Alaric nodded slowly. "And if we stay here, we wait to burn." Outside, Brantswick was quiet again, but not resting. The villagers worked through the night, repairing fences, burying their dead, and watching the ridges with wide, unblinking eyes. No one spoke of victory. No one dared, because deep down they all felt the same thing. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something much worse. The next morning, Rain prepared to leave again. This time, his pack was heavier, his map updated, and his eyes less afraid. He was no longer just a messenger. He was a witness. Mira handed him a sealed letter. Names, locations, everything they had discovered. "If you find someone who still believes in the old ways," she said, "give them this." He nodded and looked at Elric, who would go with him. The two slipped away before sunrise, avoiding the main roads and skirting the ridges where the watchers had once stood. Back in Brantswick, Mira and Alric stood in the storage barn, examining the book again. One page had been marked with a red thread, different from the others. No names, just one phrase, underlined in ink that had bled through the page. "He is not dead. He watches through others." They didn't know who he was. A former noble? A general gone rogue? A king in the shadows? But it explained the silence. It explained the quiet coordination of attacks. The message wasn't just from a rising power. It was from someone who had once fallen. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate a return from beneath history's silence. That was the second twist. They hadn't been fighting a faceless system. They had been circling around something ancient. Someone remembered by the powerful, but forgotten by the poor. Mira stepped away from the book. Whoever he is, if he's behind this, then this fire won't stop in Brantswick. Or the next village. Or the next. Alric looked up, the weight of realization pressing down on him like stone. Then we'll have to make him show his face. But before they could say more, a horn sounded, not from the forest, not from the southern road. From the sky. They ran outside, eyes turned upward, confused at first. Then, through the morning mist, they saw it. A figure on horseback, riding hard toward the village, covered in ash, his cloak shredded. It was one of their messengers, the shepherd boy. He rode like something chased him. The villagers ran to meet him. His face was streaked with soot and tears, and when he slid from the horse, he collapsed. Mira rushed forward, catching him just before he hit the ground. They found the others, he gasped. They knew we sent them. There's someone inside. Someone told them. Alric froze. A spy, the boy choked out. In Branswick, watching everything. It felt like the ground tilted beneath them. Someone among them wasn't who they claimed to be. Someone had fed their plans to the enemy. Alric's chest tightened. Did you see who? The boy shook his head. Only the ring silver, like the man at the chapel. But on a woman. Mira stood slowly. Her heart raced, not just from the boy's words, but because only a few women had come close to that man. Only a few had been near enough to see his hands. Hilda. She'd volunteered to guard the children. She'd lived in Branswick longer than anyone. She was trusted, beloved, familiar. And maybe she was the crack in everything. Mira didn't want to believe it. But the shepherd boy wasn't lying. His wounds were real. His fear wasn't imagined. The attack on the messengers had been planned, perfectly timed. Alric called a private meeting, only the most trusted. He didn't accuse anyone, but everyone understood the weight of what was happening. They had to be careful now, because if the fire had a voice inside the village, every plan they made, every name they whispered, could be leading someone else toward ruin. And so, without fully realizing it, the people of Branswick were no longer just defenders of a village. They were part of something deeper, a hidden war inside the rebellion itself, a web of betrayal and manipulation, with a silent ruler watching from the shadows, pulling strings that reached farther than anyone imagined. The conflict was no longer between villagers and a broken crown. It was a war of belief versus fear, truth versus control. And the battle hadn't truly started yet. But when it did, it would not just be fire they were fighting. It would be the face behind it. And he already knew their names. The evening light in Branswick fell like a curtain, long shadows creeping across rooftops, casting a rust-colored glow that made everything feel uneasy, like the calm before a storm that already knew where it was going to hit. Inside the chapel, Mira paced slowly, her fingers wrapped tightly around the shepherd boy's cloth-wrapped message. Her mind kept going back to what he'd said, a woman, a silver ring, someone inside the village. Every name she trusted now felt like a question. Alric sat near the altar, his jaw tight, elbows resting on his knees. He had barely spoken since the boy had passed out from exhaustion. Elric stood at the chapel door, his arms crossed, watching every movement outside like a hawk. No one had said Hilda's name yet, but her absence since midday was growing heavier with each passing moment. She said she was taking food to the cave. Mira whispered finally. For the children. That was hours ago, Elric muttered. Alric stood. Then we go. Quietly. No panic. The three of them moved quickly through the dimming light, skirting the outer paths to avoid drawing attention. Every footstep felt like it echoed too loud, and the village, once full of quiet chatter and cautious hope, now held its breath. They didn't tell anyone what they suspected. Not yet. Not until they knew. Not until they saw her with their own eyes. The path to the cave was familiar, winding between thorny underbrush and thick moss-covered stones. They moved slowly, every sound magnified by silence. As they neared the entrance, Mira heard at first voices, low, hushed and hurried. One of them unmistakably Hilda's. They crouched behind a fallen tree, heartbeats pounding in their ears. They'll find out, a second voice hissed. You waited too long. I'm buying time, Hilda answered. They trust me. Time's up. You said the fire starts at sunrise. You've done enough. Leave the rest to them. Alric's face turned pale. Mira clutched his arm. They waited, breathless, as footsteps moved closer. The other figure, a tall man cloaked in dark green, emerged from the cave and disappeared down the hill, not noticing them in the shadows. Moments later, Hilda stepped out behind him, clutching a bundle in her arms, a blanket, maybe something meant for the children. She stood for a moment, then looked out toward the village. Her eyes didn't look guilty. They looked tired. When she turned and walked back down the path, Mira finally stepped forward. Hilda, the older woman, froze. Elric, and Mira stepped into view. Hilda didn't move. Her eyes flicked toward the woods, where the man had gone, but then fell back on them. She didn't lie. She didn't deny. I did what I had to do, she said softly. To survive. Myra's voice was quiet. You told them about the messengers. About the children. Hilda nodded. Not to hurt them. Only so they wouldn't punish us all. I made promises. I thought I could control it. Elric's face darkened. You let them burn Braceford. They were going to do it anyway, Hilda snapped. They said it was already decided. I just gave them names so they'd skip us. That was the deal. Elric stepped forward slowly. But they didn't skip us. And they're not going to. Hilda looked down. No, they're not. There was a long silence. The birds didn't sing. The trees didn't move. I didn't want this, she whispered. But he is coming. And when he does, there won't be sides left. Only ashes. Myra's voice cracked. Who is he? Hilda looked up. Her eyes glistened with something like fear. You think the crown is the worst thing out there. You think rebellion is freedom. But it's not. It's bait. The real power is underneath all of it, watching both sides eat each other alive. Elric clenched his fists. Then what are we supposed to do? Give up? Kneel. Hilda didn't answer. Mira stepped back. She can't go back to the village. No, Elric said coldly. She won't. But Elric shook his head. No executions. No scenes. That's what they want, to break us from the inside. They didn't take Hilda's life, but they took her voice. She was escorted quietly to the edge of the village and left there with nothing but a flask of water and the weight of what she had done. No one followed her. No one stopped her. The wind carried her footprints away before dawn. But the damage was done. Now they knew for certain. The rebellion wasn't pure. The fire didn't only come from outside. The kingdom of flame had planted seeds within the very people who would have been its strongest resistance. Back in the chapel, Mira sat beside the sleeping children, watching them stir in their dreams. She wondered if they would remember this day, if they would grow up thinking this kind of fear was normal, if they would even grow up in Brantswick at all. Elric stared at the map again, but this time it felt smaller. Less like a world he could understand, and more like a trap he had wandered into without seeing the edge. Elric stood at the edge of the field, watching the tree line, his hand always resting on the hilt of his blade. The sunrise came slow, and with it smoke, not from inside the village this time, from the west. A column of black, rising fast, and near it, a symbol carved into the bark of a tree by the old road. A burning crown, with eyes carved beneath it. Someone was watching. Someone had just made their next move, and Brantswick was still not finished burning. The smoke from the west curled like a finger in the sky, black against the dull morning light. It wasn't thick enough to mean a full village burning yet, but it was rising, steady, and deliberate. Elric stared at it from the highest point in Brantswick's eastern ridge, his boots planted firmly in the damp soil. He didn't say a word. He just watched, because deep down he knew this wasn't a random fire. This was a signal. Below, the village was already waking up. People moved quicker now, quieter too. Every face was worn, older than it had been just a week before. Children clung closer to their mothers. Farmers stayed near the tool shed rather than the fields. And every set of eyes glanced west. Mira emerged from the chapel and joined Elric on the ridge. She didn't need to ask. The smoke said enough. We don't have much time, she whispered. He nodded, his jaw clenched tight. And if that's where Rain and Elric went. She closed her eyes for a second. Then we pray they're not too close. Down in the village square, the mood had shifted. Not fear exactly, more like a hardening. People who had once whispered questions now moved with quiet resolve. They had seen fire. They had survived betrayal. And now, they knew what it meant to stand on the edge of something they didn't fully understand. Then the bell rang. 3 quick chimes. A warning they had agreed on only days before. Enemy movement approaching fast. Mira and Elric ran downhill, weaving between homes, their breath sharp in the cold morning air. At the edge of the village, Tomas, one of the younger shepherds, stood out of breath, pointing toward the forest path. "Riders," he said. "3. Coming fast. I think it's them." Myra's heart jumped. She sprinted forward, cloak whipping behind her, and reached the outer fence just as the riders broke through the mist. It was Elric. His face streaked with mud, blood dried across one temple, his bow still slung across his back. Behind him was Rain, coughing from smoke, and a third rider neither of them recognized. A woman. Young, worn down to the bone, but alert. They stopped hard at the gates. Mira ran to them. "We saw it." Rain gasped, sliding from the horse. "The smoke, it's Dallow's reach." Alric's eyes widened. "That's 3 villages west. They're moving fast." Ray nodded. "And they're not bothering to hide it anymore." Elric dismounted and helped the third rider down. "This is Ansel, from Dallow's reach." She saw it start. She barely got out. Mira steadied the woman. Her hand was shaking, her mouth dry. "They came during daylight," Ansel said hoarsely. "No warning. No message. Just fire. And with them, not soldiers. Not the ones with torches. People in masks. And one with no face." Alric frowned. "No face." She nodded slowly. "A mask of iron. Shaped like a man's face, but hollow." He didn't speak, but the others followed him, even the ones with the fire symbol. Silence fell. This was different. More violent. More coordinated. And now, unmistakably led. Mira turned to Alric. "This is the one Hilda spoke about." Rain looked between them. "You mean the one behind all this?" Elric stepped forward, still tense from the ride. "She said he wasn't dead, that he watches through others." This sounds like him." Ansel's voice was barely above a whisper now. He stood at the center of the fire, and he watched the flames like he was reading them. Alric exhaled, slowly. "Then we've seen his warning." But Mira shook her head. "No, that wasn't a warning. That was an invitation." That afternoon, Branswick changed again. No one waited for instructions. They knew. Fires were stoked for light, not destruction. Paths were cleared, lines dug through the field to act as barriers. Those 2 young or 2 injured were led further up the ridge where an abandoned storehouse would serve as refuge. Alric, Mira, and Elric gathered in the barn with the few remaining elders and fighters. The map now lay fully unrolled on the table, its corners stained with blood, smoke, and wax. Every village crossed out had been confirmed, burned, emptied, erased. Only a few remained. And now, all paths pointed toward Branswick. "He's moving east," Mira said, one line at a time. "And we're the last one before the border towns." "Then we're more than a village now," Alric said. "We're the wall between him and whatever comes next." Rain stepped forward. "There's something else." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded scrap of cloth, dirty, frayed, and half-burned, but still legible. A symbol stitched into it. Not the flame circle, not the broken crown, but the iron face, sewn in black thread. Mira stared at it. "He's building his own army." Elric's mouth was tight, and he's not hiding anymore. Ansel spoke softly. "He calls himself the Watcher. Not a king, not a rebel, just that. He watches what burns, and what survives." Alric clenched his fists. "Then let him watch us survive." As night fell, Branswick became something else. Less a village, more a fortress of memory and defiance. There was no gold, no walls, no train guards. But there were hands that could build, eyes that refused to look away, and a kind of courage that can only be forged by fire. And as the moon rose, distant torchlight appeared again on the western horizon. Hundreds, but still no sound. Only that same, suffocating silence. Like the pause before lightning. Like a breath being held. Mira stood at the chapel steps, the silver moonlight catching her face. She didn't speak, didn't pray. She just waited, because now the fire was coming. And the Watcher, whoever he truly was walking with it. But this time, so was Branswick, and no one planned to kneel. The torches on the western horizon didn't waver as they moved. Rows of them, steady, purposeful, carried by figures cloaked in black and bronze. The light shimmered like waves, a fire line slowly pressing toward Branswick. No drums, no war cries, Just footsteps crunching through dry grass and the faint hiss of burning pitch. The silence made it worse, like the attackers already believed this was over. Mira stood on the ridge beside Alric, the wind tugging at her cloak. She could feel in her bones this was no longer a raid. This was the end they had planned from the start. A final example. A village that said no too many times. The last one standing between the Watcher and the river towns beyond. Rain stood by the chapel, torch in hand, jaw clenched. Beside him, the remaining villagers, men and women with cracked hands and aching backs, readied themselves. They were not warriors, but they had lived through fire before, and they weren't going to run. The first shadow broke from the line. A rider, alone, moving fast. Alric narrowed his eyes as the horse galloped closer. Is that? It was Elric. He had left an hour ago, disappearing without explanation. Now he returned, his cloak torn, his horse frothing at the mouth. He dismounted roughly, out of breath. They're not just soldiers, he said. I followed one of their rear patrols. Some of them aren't even alive. The words made the blood drain from Myra's face. They were faces like masks, Elric continued. Leather, iron. I don't know how, but something's keeping them moving. And they're following him. Not out of fear, out of obedience. Like he's already written their fate. Alric didn't speak. He just looked back toward the horizon. Because now, the Watcher was visible. He wasn't on a horse. He didn't carry a sword. He walked, calmly, at the center of the torchlight. Tall, thin, wrapped in layers of ash-gray cloth. And on his face, an iron mask, perfectly smooth, with hollow eye slits and no mouth. It didn't shine. It didn't reflect. It seemed to swallow light. He stopped just before the village fence and raised one hand. The soldiers stopped instantly. Mira stepped forward, heart pounding. What does he want? Alric looked to the chapel. Not land, not gold, just obedience. The Watcher raised his head and then spoke, not with his mouth, but through every torch, every fire. A voice not loud but deep. It seemed to crawl through the air and press into their minds. You are the last to resist. No one moved. You have chosen pain. Still no answer. The voice shifted, dark and strange. But I offer mercy. Kneel, and you will live. Mira stepped forward. We've lived through worse than you. The silence that followed was thick. Then the fires roared higher. The soldiers moved. Brantswick didn't wait. The first arrows flew from the rooftops. Elric dropped 2 men before they reached the fence. Rain lit the trap line near the southern path, sending fire roaring up from the oil pits they had dug days ago. Screams rang out as cloaks ignited. Villagers shouted, shovels, pitchforks, and hatchets swinging wildly. No formations, no clean battle lines, just survival. But then the Watcher moved. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply walked through the flames. Mira saw it, his cloak burning away but his body untouched. The iron mask glowed red, and everywhere he stepped, fire bent toward him like a servant. He raised his arm again, and something happened. The masked soldiers, the strange, hollow ones, began to move faster. Unnaturally fast, their limbs jerking, heads twisting at impossible angles. They stormed past the fire line, pushing villagers back toward the chapel. Alric shouted orders. Mira grabbed a fallen sword and stood beside Rain. The line buckled, and then, through the smoke, came the sound no one expected. Horns, not from the west, from the east. Another army. Mira turned, stunned. Figures were emerging from the trees. Dozens, maybe more, wearing patched armor, carrying old banners, scraps of resistance from forgotten uprisings. And at their front, riding hard and fast, was a face Mira hadn't seen in years. Captain Soren. He had fought with her father once. Disappeared after the last failed revolt. They all thought he'd been killed. Now he charged straight into the fire. His people struck the Watcher's forces from behind, cutting through the ranks like a blade. The trapped villagers surged forward again, meeting them in the middle. Chaos exploded, metal clashing, arrows flying, fire sweeping through hay and thatch. Mira found herself face to face with one of the hollow soldiers. Up close, she saw it wasn't a mask. It was a fused face. Wax-like skin melted to iron. eyes black and hollow. It raised a sword, but she ducked, slammed her shoulder into its chest, and drove her blade through its side. It didn't bleed. It collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. The watcher turned. For the first time, he hesitated. Alric saw it too. He's not invincible, he said. Something's binding him to them. And that's when Mira understood. The fire, she said. He's tied to it. It's not just a weapon. It's a chain. They turned toward the chapel. The oldest flame in Branswick still burned on its altar. A sacred hearth, always lit. If it was part of him, then maybe it could end him. Elric, Mira, and Alric ran through the fight, cutting through smoke and screams. The watcher raised both arms now, trying to command the flames, but they no longer listened to him. Not fully. As Mira reached the chapel doors, she turned and saw him falter, just for a second. Inside, she grabbed the altar torch. Elric arrow. He understood. He lit the arrow's tip with a sacred flame and aimed at the watcher's feet. The moment it struck the earth, something cracked, loud like a splitting tree. The watcher stopped moving, and so did every hollow soldier. They froze, then one by one dropped, silent. Mira looked toward the western field. The fire had stopped. The watcher was still standing, until he removed his mask and revealed nothing underneath. No face, no skin, just ash. And in the wind, he scattered, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Branswick didn't cheer. Not yet. Not until the last of the smoke cleared. Not until they were sure he was truly gone. But when the silence returned, it wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. And then Mira noticed something strange. In the sacred flame she'd carried, a new ember had formed. Faint, cold, a flicker of black. The watcher was gone, but something of him remained. Watching, waiting, still burning. In the days that followed, Branswick moved with a quiet that no longer came from fear, but from exhaustion, reflection, and the strange calm that settles after a storm. The village had survived, though it bore new scars on its buildings, its land, and deep inside its people. The fences had been broken again. Smoke still clung to the walls. And yet, every morning, someone lit the central flame in the chapel, not because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't, but because they had begun to believe in what it symbolized. Mira walked the edge of the fields with her sleeves rolled, helping clear the burn brush. The children played nearby, laughing again, their voices slowly returning to what had once been normal. Every now and then, Myra's eyes drifted toward the tree line. No more torches, no more marching, no more iron masks. But she still felt it, that ember she had seen, the one that flickered cold inside the flame. It hadn't grown, but it hadn't gone out either. Captain Soren remained in the village longer than expected. His fighters helped repair roofs, set up watch posts, and trade stories with the people over fire-cooked bread. He spoke little about where he had been all those years, though the tired look in his eyes said enough. He'd seen too many fights, too many endings, and yet something about Branswick had pulled him back. The flame, he said to Mira one night by the well, it's not just a symbol, it's a test. Some light it to keep warm, others to control. But you lit it to remember. She didn't know how to answer, so she just nodded. Alric returned to the chapel more often now, not for prayer, but to study the book they had recovered, the one with the list of villages, names, and symbols. Most of it had burned during the final battle, but a few pages survived, enough to realize something chilling. The Watcher hadn't been acting alone. The markings beside each destroyed village weren't just signs of completed attacks. They were approvals. Stamped, repeated, as if someone had reviewed them. Orders, Alric muttered to Elric. Reviewed by someone above him. But he was the leader, Elric said. Maybe not the only one. That's when the questions started to haunt them all. If the Watcher was just one hand in something larger, whose hand had he been? One night, while Rain was helping pack supplies for trade with the eastern towns, he found a folded note in his satchel. Unmarked, sealed in wax. He brought it to Mira and Alric without opening it. Inside, written in clean, practiced handwriting, was a single line. You remove the mask, but not the mirror. Under it, a symbol, two circles side by side, connected by a faint thread. None of them recognized it, but Mira felt something twist in her gut. like a warning that hadn't reached its full meaning yet. Still, Brantwick could not live in shadows forever. As the land healed, so did the people. Crops were replanted. Songs returned, slowly. A wedding was planned. Two farmers who had fallen in love after tending to the wounded together. Life had found its way back in. One evening, Mira stood on the chapel steps as the sun lowered, casting long amber streaks across the ground. The flame in the hearth still flickered behind her, warm, bright, and steady. A child ran past her laughing, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled without forcing it. Alric joined her, wiping his hands clean of soot. "Do you think it's over?" she asked quietly. He didn't rush to answer. "I think the worst part is," he said, "we might not know until it begins again. But we'll be ready," she replied. He nodded. "Yes, because now we believe in more than just survival. We believe in each other." Behind them, Elric was teaching a group of young villagers how to craft arrows. Rain had mapped out a new route to the next trading town. Soren sat near the edge of the field with a journal open in his lap, drawing what looked like a crest. A new symbol, not for war, but for warning. They had faced something ancient, something that had no name until they gave it one. And they had endured not by matching its power, but by refusing its silence. Still, on some nights, Mira would wake with a start. The dream was always the same. A flicker, a whisper, and a mirror cracked straight down the middle, with fire burning on both sides. She'd walk to the chapel, check the flame, and sit there until morning. Not because she feared it, but because she respected it. The ember hadn't grown, but hadn't died. Maybe that was the lesson. Some things never burn out completely. They wait. For weakness. For anger. For silence. And Brantwick had learned that the best way to face the fire was together. The season shifted gently after the final battle. Summer slipping into early autumn. The sun a little lower, the air carrying the scent of dried leaves and with smoke rather than fear. Brantwick, though scarred, wore its quiet resilience like a second skin. The villagers no longer flinched at every gust of wind. The children laughed louder. The field showed green again, where ash once lay heavy. Each day brought a little more light into their lives. But some things lingered. Mira had taken to writing. At first, it was just to remember the names of those they had lost. It became stories, descriptions of what they'd seen, what they'd survived. She wrote by candlelight inside the chapel's back room, the same place where she'd once crouched with injured villagers. Her pages filled with truth, not legends, because truth, she'd come to realize, was more fragile than any sword, and someone had to protect it. Alric continued studying the pages saved from the Watcher's book. The ink had faded in parts, but a pattern had begun to emerge. Each burned village had something in common, not just location or resistance, but bloodlines. Certain names appeared again and again, some crossed out, some underlined. He brought this to Soren, who sat in the old stable-turned watchtower, sketching out what remained of their defensive network. They weren't attacking places, Alric said quietly. They were targeting people. Soren leaned over the parchment. Families, bloodlines, traits. I don't know. But look, this same surname appears in 5 different towns, generations apart. Soren frowned. And Brantwick? Alric tapped a name at the bottom of the page. Mira. That night, Alric and Soren sat with her. She listened carefully, not shocked, but chilled. I've heard the name before, she admitted. My grandmother once said we came from a line of scribes, that we were once advisors to kings before something happened. She never said what, just that we were better off forgotten. Soren leaned back. Then maybe this wasn't just about burning villages. Maybe the Watcher was cleansing the kingdom of anyone who remembered the old truths. Mira closed her eyes. The idea made sense in the worst kind of way. It explained the quiet precision. The records. The symbols. She hadn't just been lucky to survive. She had been on a list. A target. And now, she might be the last one left. Later that week, Rain returned from the river town of Meldon with news. Good and bad. The good. The eastern border was secure. No attacks. No signs of the Watcher's army. Trade routes were open again. The bad. People were vanishing. Whole families taken in the night. No fire. No destruction, just silence, as if they'd never been there at all. Elric listened in silence. Not fire this time, he said grimly. They're changing tactics. Mira felt it again, that uneasy breath, that sense of something unfinished. They're removing people without leaving a mark, she whispered. Soren nodded. Because the Watcher may be gone, but the ones who approved his work, they're still watching, Alric finished. They all looked at each other. No one needed to say it. This wasn't over. But Brantswick wasn't the same village anymore. They'd learned how to endure, how to question, how to defend without turning to cruelty. And, maybe most importantly, they'd learned how to notice when the silence meant more than noise ever could. In the following days, Mira traveled with Rain and Elric to nearby towns. Not to fight, but to share their story. They didn't speak in speeches. They spoke in truth, in firelight whispers, in chapel benches, and behind kitchen doors. They didn't tell people what to do. They just told them what had happened. In time, others began to whisper back. About strange visitors asking too many questions. About names that vanished from records. About people who seemed to follow the fire, not to stop it, but to understand it, to continue it. One town had painted a symbol on the side of a grain house. 2 circles, a faint line between. The same symbol left on the letter Rain had found. The mirror. Mira stood in front of that painted wall, staring at it for a long time. What do you think it means? Elric asked beside her. That something else is coming, she said. Not like before. Not burning villages, but twisting the truth. Hiding it. And what do we do? He asked. She smiled faintly. We keep telling the truth louder than they can erase it. When they returned to Brantswick, autumn had fully arrived. The leaves had turned orange and brittle, and the mornings carried frost. But the flame in the chapel still burned, unchanged. One night, Mira woke from another dream. This time, not of fire, but of water. A river, wide and dark, stretching endlessly in both directions. On one bank, Brantswick. On the other, a land she couldn't name. And between them, a single bridge, just barely holding together. She stood at its edge, unsure whether to cross. Then a whisper, soft as breath. Some truths must cross over. She awoke with tears on her cheeks, unsure why. She walked to the chapel again, sat before the flame, and there, in its soft glow, she saw something unexpected. Not the ember, not the mirror, but a page. Old parchment, folded, just sitting there, as if someone had left it for her. She picked it up, hands trembling. On it, written in the same careful ink as before. He waits on the far bank, and he does not forget. The bottom was signed, not with a name, but with a date. 1 year from that day. A year until something began again. She folded the page slowly, then stood. Brantswick had 1 year. 1 year to prepare. 1 year to remember. 1 year before the truth would be tested again. And this time it would not be by fire, but by silence. And in that silence they would either stand or disappear completely. But Mira would be ready, because now she finally understood. The real war wasn't just between tyrants and rebels. It was between forgetting and remembering, and she refused to forget. The wind in Brantswick carried a different sound now. No longer the crackling threat of fire or the hollow shuffle of massed soldiers, but something quieter, softer. The rustle of trees returning to peace. The buzz of insects in fields not yet harvested. Footsteps over packed dirt, not from urgency, but from purpose. In the weeks that followed the final confrontation, the village settled back into itself like a deep breath finally released. Mira stood in the chapel doorway, most mornings, watching the sunrise stretch its gold across the rooftops. The sacred flame burned gently behind her, steady as her own heartbeat. What had once felt like a burden now felt like a guide. It reminded her of everyone they had lost and everyone they had protected. It wasn't about power or fear anymore. It was about memory, about truth. Alric took on the quiet task of organizing what remained of the Watcher's book. Most pages were damaged beyond saving, but the few that remained were enough to understand the larger plan. The attacks hadn't been random or emotional. They were cold, calculated moves meant to erase certain lines of history, certain names. People who might have carried knowledge dangerous to someone in power. People like Mira. Alaric built a record from these fragments and stored it in the chapel cellar, hoping one day, if someone needed it again, they'd know where to look. Rain went back to trading routes, but with a different purpose. He wasn't just moving goods between towns. He was sharing stories. Stories of the fire, of the iron mask, of the man who walked through flame, and the village that didn't fall. People listened, some with disbelief, others with tears, but they listened. That was what mattered. Truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be told. Elric began teaching again. Young boys and girls sat around him in the shade behind the chapel as he showed them how to handle a bow, how to track deer, how to listen to the forest. But more than that, he taught them how to read the signs of silence, how to notice when something was wrong, even when no one said a word. He didn't talk much about the battle, but the way he moved said he carried it with him. Captain Soren stayed for a time, long enough to help rebuild the outer fence and plant trees along the perimeter. He left quietly one morning, leaving behind a note tucked in Myra's journal. You stood when many would have run. That means more than you know. No one knew where he went, but Mira had a feeling he'd show up again if a need ever rose. The children who had once huddled in fear in the chapel now ran through the fields, chasing each other with sticks and laughter. Their nightmares didn't vanish overnight, but they faded like smoke. The village made sure they knew the truth, but didn't let that truth steal their childhoods. That balance mattered. Hilda was never seen again. Some said she crossed into the hills to start over. Others believed she'd gone searching for those responsible, trying to make peace with what she'd done. Mira never spoke ill of her. She couldn't forget the betrayal, but she also couldn't ignore the fear that had driven it. People do strange things when they think it's the only way to survive. That didn't make it right, but it made it human. And as for the Watcher, no one ever found a body. Only the ashes where he had stood and the iron mask, half buried in the scorched earth. It no longer held any power. It was just metal now. Mira placed it in the cellar next to the book, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. As the first snowfall touched Branswick, Mira sat with Alric by the fire, wrapped in silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Outside, lanterns flickered warmly in the windows. The village looked like it always had, but something deeper had shifted. I used to think we were just a quiet place, Mira said softly. Alric glanced at her. We still are. We just know how loud the world can get. She nodded, and how to answer it. That night, Mira wrote the final entry in her journal. She wrote about the fire, the fear, the fight, but more importantly, she wrote about what came after, the rebuilding, the listening, the choice not to forget. She ended with a simple sentence. The fire didn't end us. It revealed us, because that's what the violent revolts of the past had always hinted at. Not just rebellion, not just survival, but a reckoning with what people will do when pushed too far, and what they can become when they choose to stand instead of bow. Medieval peasants didn't rise because they loved chaos. They rose because they had been quiet too long. And sometimes silence can become its own kind of violence. Branswick had nearly broken, but it hadn't. And now, in its quiet strength, it carried something bigger than itself. Proof that even a forgotten village, with nothing but old tools and steady hearts, could shape history. The snow fell heavier that evening, covering the ground like a fresh page. And for the first time in a long time, Mira let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, peace would stay a little longer. If not forever, then long enough to matter. And that was enough. Ask ChatGPT. By the time winter settled fully over Branswick, the land lay in silence. Not the fearful stillness of war, but the soft hush of a village learning how to breathe again. Snow blanketed the rooftops and rested in gentle mounds along stone walls. Smoke from hearths curled up into the gray sky, like memories slowly drifting away. Everything felt slower, as if the earth itself had agreed to let the people rest. Mira spent her mornings walking the edge of the forest trail. What was once a path for scouts and sentries was now a simple walk for reflection. She still carried her small leather journal, the one filled with notes from the dark days. But these pages were different. They weren't about the Watcher or the flames or the old symbols. These were stories about rebuilding, about laughter returning to kitchens, and songs being sung softly as meals cooked over fires. It wasn't history meant for kings or war rooms. It was meant for those who lived through it, the ones who remained. In the chapel, Alric continued sorting records. With Soren gone and the unrest quiet for now, he found comfort in order. He repaired the books that had been damaged, copied the remaining maps by hand, and rewrote every name of the lost. Not in a list, but in a woven paragraph of remembrance. Each name a sentence, each sentence part of their living history. On the wall beside the hearth, Mira had drawn a simple symbol, a tree, its roots deep, its branches reaching beyond the frame. It was their emblem now, not rebellion, not a crown, just something that grew even after it had been burned. Rain had become something of a messenger, not just between towns, but between people. He carried letters and shared words and stories, acting like a thread that kept distant places stitched together. He wasn't the same man who once rolled his eyes at causes or doubted the weight of loyalty. Branswick had changed him, just as he had helped change Branswick. Now he wore his scars with quiet pride. He knew his purpose wasn't finished. He just finally understood it. Elric, ever the quiet protector, had taken to building a new watchtower on the eastern ridge, not for fear of an immediate threat, but as a reminder that being prepared didn't mean living in paranoia. It meant learning, watching, understanding the rhythms of the land. He taught the younger villagers to recognize tracks in the snow, how to listen to the wind, how to notice the difference between silence that was peaceful and silence that warned. He never spoke about the mask again, but Mira knew he hadn't forgotten. One evening, just before the longest night of the year, the villagers gathered at the chapel. It wasn't ceremony, no speeches, no rituals, just everyone together, sharing warmth. Bread was passed around. Children handed out candles. Mira stepped forward to relight the sacred flame, the same one they had feared, fought beside, and finally reclaimed. When the flame rose, steady and golden, no one clapped. They simply stood and watched it flicker, quiet and whole. In that moment, there was no crown, no watcher, no fear. Just people, survivors, neighbors, a village that had found its soul again. Later that night, Mira stayed behind after the others had gone. Snow pressed against the windows in soft gusts. The silence was thick, but not empty. She sat beside the flame, flipping to the final page of her journal. She wrote slowly. Some will forget our name. Others will speak of fire and fear. But the truth is, we lived, not because we were stronger, but because we stood when it mattered. She set the journal on the altar beside the mask. The iron face no longer held power, but it reminded her of everything they'd overcome. She had kept it not out of fear, but to ensure the story stayed real. The temptation to erase it was strong, but forgetting would be the same as losing. As the wind outside howled, she looked at the fire again. Something in it danced, just a flicker, and she tilted her head. She didn't feel watched. Not anymore. But she did feel remembered. By spring, seeds were already planted. The fields were green again. Children born after the battle would grow up hearing it not as a nightmare, but as a turning point. And maybe that was enough. Not victory, not revenge, but a place in time that meant something. One day, Mira took a walk past the edge of the forest. She carried no journal, no weapon, just a small satchel with bread and dried fruit. When she reached the edge of the hill, she found a stone placed carefully by the roots of a tall tree. It wasn't a grave, no name carved, just a marker, a sign someone else had stood there before. She placed her hand on it gently. Whether it was Soren, a stranger, or someone she'd never meet, she didn't need to know. What mattered was that they'd stood, that they'd left something behind. She sat under the tree for a while, watching the sky. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't wait for fire or war or shadows. She just breathed, because in Branswick, the past no longer chased them. And for once, the future didn't frighten them. It waited patiently, and they were finally ready to walk into it, one story at a time. Peacefully, boldly, together. Ask ChatGPT.